Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are you? It's Wednesday, meaning the week is already half gone. Time keeps moving faster for me, and it seems like I'm just chipping away at my workload rather than accomplishing anything substantive. I figured out that I have nearly 360,000 words to record this year, and I'm still way behind the 8 ball. Alas, I'm working on it. It's just damn slow going. What's not slow going is this story. It's about to go into overdrive, so I hope you're ready. I also hope you enjoy. Be safe, have a great couple of days, and we'll talk again on Friday. Here's episode 17 of Neptune Scars. Chapter 35. Wearing a combat suit with a gravitic rifle strapped to his back, not to mention a belt of grenades and other munitions, Dunn remained in the ready room. He was as prepped as he could be. He'd set the holo displays to cover the entire bulkhead, so he had a seamless view across the many different cam feeds. In addition, the trio had added a 3D hologram of Trident Station, the shipyards, and marked every turret and the locations of Kalimura's forces. In other words, he had the game board in front of him and all his available pieces waiting for the first roll of the dice. They wouldn't have to wait long. Neptune's outer satellites had gone dark, and the trio had lost contact with the sensor networks. The creatures were affecting everything. Whatever exotic EMR field the Horde generated had rendered Trident's proverbial eyes and ears blind and deaf. Visual and radar were all the tools they had now to spot the creatures. Fortunately, that was all the trio needed to target and destroy. Unfortunately, Trident's human gunners wouldn't have the same accuracy. Visual and radar were the only tools they had now to spot the creatures. Fortunately, that was all the trio needed to target and destroy. Unfortunately, Trident's human gunners wouldn't have the same accuracy. Fortunas had predicted an accuracy rate of 5% long range, 12.5 at medium, and 5 again at close range due to the Exo's knack for acceleration and deceleration. The creatures wouldn't exactly float idly by for the gunners to target them. Instead, they'd begin tearing apart the infrastructure at the very least, most likely to build nests and capture prey. 5%. If not for the recalcitrant crew, they could have been drilling on this for weeks. No, that happened because you refused to lead, his subconscious told him. Because you refused to force the population to see what would happen, and because you wanted to believe the real threat was over. Was that true? Had he been unwilling to face that fact, or had he simply been too concerned, juggling station construction, supply situations, and navigating politics? You have subordinates, he told himself. Use them next time. Sighing, Dunn spun the holographic sphere. Crimson blobs suddenly appeared on one side. Fortunas? The exosolar creatures are 2 minutes out. Sound the alarm, he said quietly. Trident Station's intercoms came to life. Attention all hands, Fortuna said. Threat imminent. All personnel to action and emergency stations. I repeat, all personnel to action and emergency stations. Fortunas paused a beat before repeating the first few words of the message and then going silent as the entity muted the ready room's alerts. Thank you, Dunn said, his voice barely audible. He was already studying the creature's formations and the integrity of the sphere of death approaching his sphere of concern. As large as Trident was, the Horde was nearly twice its size, at least in the manner it had spread itself out. It was far too early for Fortunas and the trio to count the incoming, and Dunn wasn't sure he even wanted to know. We detect 4 large signatures, Fortuna said, and instead of arrows, 4 blobbish shapes appeared. The quartet kept more than a kilometer of space between them, but he noticed much of the Horde seemed to be structured around the Leviathans. 1 minute, Fortuna said, as though he were merely telling Dunn that space was dark. Kalimura, Dunn said, 1 minute. Copy, 1 minute aye, she said back over the comms. Dunn heard her relay the message to her troops in the call-ins. Gunners, he said, prepare for targets. Instead of radio traffic confirming the order, a list appeared with green checks next to turret locations. The others remained yellow, indicating the trio would be handling those. Civilian fire teams, prepare for incoming. Another confirmation list appeared. Dunn remained standing but kept his hands on the interface while leaning back slightly. He'd done all he can do, and now it was just a matter of coordinating the losing side of a massacre. Think like that, and it will be a massacre, a voice said in his mind. Don't think like that, he told himself, and you won't win. Kali's HUD lit up with 2 alerts. The decoy reactors had powered up and were ready to go critical, each reactor running at 115% capacity. The first shimmers began appearing in space, dimly outlining hellish shapes that had no place in nature. Thousands of starfish, and who knew what else, swooped toward them like a sphere of shimmering void. "Weapons free," Dunn said over the comms, just as the horde reached the first reactor. A large cluster of the creatures made their way to it just in time for it to blossom into a kiloton explosion. The other two went off mere beats later, but that's when the first of the Leviathans hove into view. From this distance, it was little more than an amorphous shape, but the radius of the shimmer from its body was too thick to deny. That thing had to be at least as large as a collective cargo cruiser. The first station turrets came to life, and arrays of silver teardrops filled the space above and below her, the rounds flashing when they struck an exo. Kelly wasn't seeing enough flashes. Cursing, she connected to Dunn. "We got a Leviathan," she said, and relayed the coordinates. "Coming in fast." "We see it," Dunn said. "Missiles launching now." A moment later, a pair of rockets streaked from Trident's dorsal batteries, focusing instead on the incoming wave. She activated her own turret and blasted several of the exos as they closed. The turrets were a little more accurate now, but it wasn't enough. The creatures were fanning out, purposely making sure they didn't overlap. "We need flak," she said softly, knowing all too well they didn't have any. Memento mori, she thought. A flock of starfish, each twice the size of the large ones she'd fought aboard Mira, screamed directly at them. Kelly shouted to her squad, "Move!" and the skiff blasted away from the dock. Cuccia and Osorio went to work piloting and firing at the flock. One of the starfish loosed a lance of acid at the skiff, but Cuccia easily piloted away from it. Kelly put 2 gravitic rounds in the thing's center before shifting targets and blasting another one to pieces. "Ventral!" she yelled, and the skiff dropped as though off a mountain. She reoriented the turret and began firing upward as they continued plummeting towards Trident's belly. 2 of the starfish dipped down with them. One of them spat, and acid hit her turret, the substance sliding off the metal with little damage. She rewarded it with a fatal double tap. The other, a little smarter, swooped past the turret, its arms outstretched to grab Osorio. He turned without warning and hit it with tritium flechettes, knocking the creature away and spinning off into the darkness, its carapace effectively shattered. Kelly watched as the stars above her disappeared in waves, only to reappear with telltale shimmers crowning the light. That had been the advance wave. The horde was here. The missiles, each loaded with megaton warheads, accelerated at 80 Gs toward their target. The tungsten carbide reinforced atmo-steel tips crashed through the starfish and other strange creatures alike before finding their target. Each missile connected with the massive Leviathan, their speed and mass carrying them through the thing's thick carapace and deep into its belly. The nukes went off. The Leviathan and every creature near it immediately disappeared in a flash bright enough to bathe Trident in a brief spate of light. That explosion also highlighted the horde's numbers. Any human that had seen the explosion felt a supernatural dread descend over them. The numbers were staggering and incomprehensible. Several gunners paused at their posts, their minds desperately trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Most returned to firing. Some merely stared in horror and fear. "Shit," Talby muttered. A wave of the creatures had gotten past the nuclear decoys and headed directly between the shipyards and Trident. "Squad Beta got eyes on exos. Weapons free." "Copy," Wynn said, and Talby watched as the skiff slowly appeared from behind one of the station supports. Talby, clamped nearly half a kilometer away from the skiff, detached and touched the throttle a few times to get into position. He glanced in the direction of the shipyards and saw the horde hadn't yet begun to attack it. For the moment, they were far more interested in Trident and the goodies it contained. A missile streaked from the personnel module into the gap between Trident and the shipyards and exploded in a retina-smashing blast of light. "That's our cue, Beta," Talby said. Wind hit the thrusters, and the skiff quickly accelerated from beneath the station, hugging the side of the hangar modules, turrets searching for convenient targets. Speaking of, Talby spotted a flock of starfish working their way into one of the incomplete scaffolds for the next stack of modules. If they got in there, they could easily tear through the construction blocks and get inside the station. He marked the target. "Search and destroy, Beta." "Copy," Wynn said, and the skiff activated its gravitic engines for a brief moment before shooting across to the partially constructed module stack. Talby shadowed them from a healthy altitude, his attention split between the skiff's cam feed, the horde filtering into the empty space beyond the module stack, and waiting for one of the Leviathans to appear, or for a flock to attack the hull directly. Went's turret cam rotated and followed a fast-moving clump of shadows. The skiff quickly accelerated to catch up, and Went loosed a broadside. The gravitic rounds detonated and shattered the clump into fragments of carapace and silver acid. Another clump melted out of the darkness, and the skiff raced to head it off. A new target on his HUD appeared, and Talby cursed, spinning the SV just in time to avoid an oncoming flock. The SV's turret unloaded at the creatures, some of the rounds striking Trident's hull and leaving strange eddies of shimmering light. 4 clusters of creatures headed into the module stack. "We're going hunting," he said to his gunner. Talby flipped the craft 90 degrees and nudged the gravitics to put him into a fast dive, his gunner firing at targets all the way down to Trident's infrastructure level. The flock that had nearly rammed him was turning back, but were meeting both Trident's turrets and the SV's guns. He barely noticed. Instead of what was behind, he was focused on the clumps sweeping toward the partial construction. Dozens of them were heading inside, and Went would soon have a little more company than he needed. "Beta skiff, you've got a lot of incoming," Talby said. "Copy," Went said. "Joining you in a minute," Talby said as he fired off a quick burst from the cabin guns. Several teardrop-shaped rounds streaked from the SV and into the superstructure. One of the clumps spread apart in a tumble of creatures and pieces of shattered carapace and arms. The survivors continued on their path unabated. "Fuck!" Talby shouted, and pushed the thrusters again. The SV sped forward as he headed for the gap between Trident and the shipyards. Before he swung out into space, he turned 90 degrees in the horizontal plane and again jetted, only this time into the infrastructure. His gunner drew in a deep breath. "Major?" Talby grinned as he piloted the SV through a support tunnel that barely gave him 2 meters of spherical clearance. A few seconds later, he saw the end of the tunnel and where the SV would pop out. "Went, coming in at your 8 o'clock. Went's feeds bounced as the skiff maneuvered in the tight area, the turret firing at the 4 large starfish that flew toward the construction airlock. It was almost as if the creatures knew how to get in, unless they were attacking the other areas as well. When the SV popped out, Talby nearly clipped the starfish before firing a burst at it. The thing shattered and scattered, its chitinous debris tinging off the vehicle's hull. He cut across the intersection, his gunner alternately firing flechette flak and gravitic pulses. A storm of debris clattered against the hull, and an errant grav pulse from the skiff hit them with the delicacy of a tissue landing atop a bug. The world shimmered silver for a moment before the effects disappeared, as suddenly as they had appeared. Talby flipped the SV and hit the engines in a hard burn. The grav drives cut his speed, G-forces pounding into both he and his gunner. Wiggins groaned in the seat behind him. "Don't puke," Talby managed through clenched teeth. The message was as much to himself as his gunner. Wiggins didn't puke, but the turret began firing another barrage into the confused cloud of creatures. They had been advancing before Went started blowing them away. Then Talby had come in like a bowling ball, shattering pins made of ice. The creatures, unable to form a ball in the tight confines, appeared to try and retreat. Neither Went nor Wiggins gave them the chance. A few stragglers made it back into the tubes, the SV already moving to intercept them. "Went, check the other module." "Copy," Went said, moving to position. Talby fired the cabin cannons and took out one of the stragglers, before he popped out of the infrastructure and into the shadow of something larger and more terrifying than he'd thought imaginable. Chapter 36. The flash from the first round of nukes barely caught her attention. Kelly was too busy focusing fire on a cluster of starfish heading for the ventral modules. She managed to get 4 of them and break apart the ball of creatures before she lost sight of it. Cursing, she rotated looking for the next target. A massive thing had appeared from the shadows, its obsidian outline shimmering with silvery waves. The creature had to be at least 5 times the size of Black, and creatures covered its surface. Before Kali could think to fire a shot, the first of the radiation decoys went critical. The alien creature continued forward, unmindful of the innocuous-looking cylinders below it. The creature, before it moved into range, spat a line of silver at the station, the meter-diameter jet of acid washing over multiple modules and infrastructure supports. The powerful acid burned through atmosteel, leaving gashes in the most resilient material humankind had ever created. The skiff jumped and quickly rotated, Kali's turrets coming to bear on the beast when the first of the cylinders went off. The flash obliterated her HUD for an instant as the visor blocked the apocalyptic flood of photons and EMR. The blast punctured the monster's belly, but it continued moving, hundreds or thousands of creatures swooping off its surface and heading for Trident. The Leviathan, grievously wounded, turned from the gap between the shipyards and Trident and headed for the station itself. The unbelievably huge creature unfurled tentacles which whipped lazily out before lashing the station's outer modules. Kelly's headset lit up with radio traffic. Dunn shouting they needed more missiles, Lowell firing a salvo at the creature while confirming Alpha's cover. Osorio and Cuccia were flying and aiming, and Kelly was trapped in her own little world of panic and terror. She had stopped shooting. She had stopped giving orders. Kelly had stopped being in the fight. The Leviathan moved closer to the station, one of its tentacles nearly severing the skiff in twain. Osorio was asking for orders, and Kelly couldn't find her voice. The creature's undulating surface shimmered for an instant before another missile slammed into its misshapen head, its bulbous alien eyes bursting in nuclear fire. The flash kicked something over in Kelly's mind, the light destroying the darkness before it all became darkness, until something new would be born of it. Darkness. Become the darkness. The Leviathan descended in spasmodic jerks, its tentacles continuing to lash out and smash into Trident's starboard module array. The cannons continued firing, gravitic pulses penetrating the thing's carapace, while starfish and pine cones and other things she didn't recognize swarmed to that side, either to provide cover or a distraction. The cannons continued their barrage, the giant thing seemingly dead but continuing to drift. It was going to hit the station's ventral edge, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Dunn watched the dying Leviathan clip the ventral module array, smashing through one of them and dislodging the entire rack. Casualty reports were coming in, but he barely looked at them. So long as the station had power, he couldn't worry about incidental structural damage. What had him more concerned was the jet of acid the Leviathan had doled out over the station. Several unoccupied exterior modules have vented to space. Fortunately, the inner modules, the most protected ones, remained intact and undisturbed. Small favors. There were at least 2 more big ones out there, each the size of the monstrosity that had nearly destroyed the station's starboard side. The starfish numbers had multiplied greatly, along with herds of pine cones roaming space like meat-seeking missiles. As fast as the gunners could take them out, sortie after sortie arrived in their stead. Trident was running through its missile stores in rapid fashion, but the last 2 hadn't even struck the Leviathans. They'd been stopped by clusters of starfish before reaching their targets. Fairly soon, Trident wouldn't be able to use nuclear ordnance. The creatures were too close. By that time, he'd have to hope the concentrated fire from the cannons would do enough damage to take them down before they destroyed the station. From shipyards? Nothing. Not a single shot had been fired. Its automatons raced through the swarms, firing until they ran out of energy and detonating their reactors. The flashes were bright, but the damage confined to a few hundred meters in diameter. Considering what seemed like hundreds of thousands of the fucking things were descending on the station, he little hoped the remaining decoys or the turrets would have much of an effect. Portunas, ask Cartwright what the fuck is going on. Too much interference, Portunas said. I cannot establish a connection to the gunny entity. Dunn growled low in his throat. What the fuck are you doing, Gunny? Talby's gunner swatted a cluster of starfish apart before they could close on Went's skiff. The creature spread apart and immediately gave chase to the SV. Grinning maniacally, Talby pushed the SV hard to starboard and started a hard burn that pushed both Wiegans and him into their couches. The G's felt good for some reason, his grin only widening. Get ready, he managed through clenched teeth. Once he was sure he had enough distance, he flipped the SV. Weapons free, he shouted, and started the cabin guns, the turret joining him a second later. The group of starfish, dozens in all, had continued the chase, either hoping for a meal or to merely attack what had attacked them. Either way, Wiggins' pulses shattered carapaces and legs, 4 of the starfish obliterated in less than a second. Talby adjusted the craft slightly, the SV sliding to starboard and back to port while he continued holding down the trigger. As the creatures tried to move out of Wiegand's sights, they flew right into Talby's. The cabin cannons filled the space with tritium flak, the deadly water droplets spraying out in all directions and catching a clump of 6 starfish. The creatures detonated in a shower of obsidian shell and crumbs. Hold on, Talby said. The creatures were still coming, and they'd be on the craft in seconds. He tilted the SV and accelerated to 9 Gs, the SV blasting away from the creatures and heading toward Trident's dorsal side. The starfish followed in his wake, streams of silver acid lashing through the area he'd just been. As he led them over the top of the station, the gunners fired their flak and pulse rounds. The flak quickly disintegrated from the deadly tritium flechette flak and gravitic ammunition. "Woo!" Wiegans yelled. "That was awesome!" "Glad you liked it," Talby said. "Get ready to do it again." Kelly's skiff bucked and slid sideways, the impact jarring her brain. "Fucking starfish!" Kuchia shouted. Her HUD lit with a damage report and she cursed. One of the starboard thrusters had been hit and was no longer operational. The other only had 30% power. "Move!" Kelly shouted as she spied another cluster of the creatures approaching. Osorio opened the throttle and pushed the gravitic engines to full. The skiff burst forward and added negative vector while accelerating at 6 Gs. She turned the turret to face aft and peppered the starfish with pulse rounds, Kuchia blasting away with his own rifle at anything that came too close. Her turret guns were overheating and their batteries were nearing the end of their charge. In a few moments, she might not be able to fire a single burst. "Head for infrastructure, now!" she shouted. The skiff dipped harder this time, Kelly training the guns but not firing them. With each passing second, the guns were cooling, the battery recharging, and her chance to dole out payback rising. The skiff headed into the fractured and incomplete rack of modules on the ventral edge, the same one the Leviathan had wrecked into. The skiff turned hard, the port thrusters coming to life with all the power they had to keep the skiff from ramming into a line of bulkheads. The starfish followed them into the channel, their arms all forward as if waiting to grab onto the skiff or pluck one of the Marines from its frame. Kelly gave the guns another second, readjusted her aim, and held down the trigger. The cannons spat a line of gravitic rounds behind them, each one finding a target. The cramped confines meant the creatures couldn't escape or flee. Instead, they disappeared in the patter of crumbs and broken limbs. The skiff roared out of the infrastructure and into the gap between the shipyards and Trident Station. The creatures had gathered on that side, space shimmering and dancing as though it had become engulfed in a psychedelic aura. Directly above the skiff, the creatures moved in a kilometer-wide tornadic blizzard of darkness so thick she couldn't make out a single creature for the horde. The gunners, 20 or so, fired into the abyss with reckless abandon, not knowing if they were hitting anything. Kelly was sure they were. A missile alert appeared on her HUD and Kelly screamed at Kuchia. He put the skiff into a deep dive at 6 Gs, the tornado immediately getting further and further away. She didn't bother looking up when the missile struck. A wave of EMR engulfed the skiff and her HUD blinked with radiation warnings, each in the yellow rather than the dreaded red. When she peered back up, the tornado continued in dizzyingly fast revolutions, an asteroid belt of pulverized carapaces and limbs spreading in all directions. "Lowell?" "Here?" Kelly licked her lips before saying, "Is it just me or did all the exos become the tornado?" She knew she was right as another cluster of starfish approached and then was consumed by the tornado. Trident's guns continued firing but didn't seem to be doing much more than catching the outer layers. A few of the shipyard automatons approached the tornado, guns blazing until they reached its edges. Each one went critical, producing a small nuclear detonation. The flashes only served to highlight the monstrous conglomeration of creatures and their twister of doom. Kuchia made terrified sounds over the radio. He might even have been weeping. Kelly's finger clenched the trigger and the turret fired gravitic bursts until it overheated and shut down. The tornado rose above Trident's ventral side and far below. Kelly watched in terror as the vertical tornado bent, the top of the swirling mass leaning toward the station. Dark objects spun off from the tornado at a blinding velocity before striking the atmosteel hull plates. Even from this distance, she could tell the bulkheads had fractured. The shapes of what might have been people floating into space were quickly lost as the maelstrom continued. Several guns stopped firing while others stuttered before disappearing from the fray. The tornado was flinging creatures at incredible speed, the bodies smashing against the hull, acidic blood creating weak spots before another round crashed through. Kelly shouted, "All company, redoubt! I repeat, redoubt!" Kuchia reacted immediately by swinging the skiff around to point back at Trident. They were heading to the ventral side, the place where the artillery would be most effective. Kelly knew her tiny force couldn't possibly win against that mass of creatures. All she could do was retreat until she figured something out. As another round of the creatures crashed through Trident's hull, she hoped she came up with a solution fast. Gunny watched the fray in horror, but there was little he could do about it. The turrets had done their job, but many of them, the surplus, were still catching up, heading in from the outer moons at high speed. They might arrive too late. The space between the station and the shipyards had become a funnel cloud of creatures, the edges of space and reality seeming to bend around them. Proximity alarms went off in his sensor network, and he immediately identified the collective ship. The small craft had accelerated to 40 Gs before flipping and burning again to decelerate. He calculated the craft had finished its deceleration in the space of 10 seconds. Boyd wept, but nothing biological could handle that. He couldn't even imagine components handling that kind of strain. The ship docked at the mooring point while he stood helpless watching Trident being torn apart. The shipyard's cannons fired at any Exos that approached, but the funnel was too far out of range. He detected a contact rising from the newly arrived vessel. An orb, similar to the one Von On had arrived in, moved across the dock into the LeBlanc. An armored circular hatch opened in LeBlanc's starboard hull as the orb traveled inside, the hatch closing around it. "About fucking time," he said to no one. The ship's running lights came to life, its nuclear and gravitic engines warming up for the first time since the ship was completed over a month ago. The world around him stuttered, the colors fading and blanching. The shipyards lost resolution before pixelating into incomprehensible garbage. Gunny screamed as something pulled at him, draining him. Flash. 100 cameras showed him views from all angles of space. It took him a moment before his consciousness, for lack of a better term, properly interfaced. A millisecond later, he felt the systems come to life, each one an imaginary button or switch he could control. Dead, quantum or digital, and still thinking in analog. The LeBlanc's sensors reported disturbances in a large range, but unlike being inside his own sim, the disturbances were no longer amorphous shapes, but shimmering curtains of energy that radiated outward as though blown by a breeze. 2 Leviathans were heading in, the massive creatures carrying payloads of starfish, pine cones, and other creatures the humans had yet to name and Gunny couldn't classify. In moments, they would join the tornado in their assault on Trident. New sensor readings cascaded across his consciousness, and he knew what would come next. The mooring clamps holding the vessel in place automatically disengaged, and the gravitic engines came to life. For the first time since its manufacture, the LeBlanc was entering the fight.